Yeah, very nice to see everyone. Thanks for joining us. The original purpose of this is this, this event. The idea of this is, of course, inspired by the sad and terrible events in the Ukraine that I'm sure many of us have been following. It's it's been a terrible time for those of us who feel the pain of the millions of people, innocent people who've had to flee their houses, had to flee their country, say goodbye to their loved ones, displaced into wherever. We had people arriving here in Cornwall, on the western outskirts of Europe, very disturbed people who basically lost everything. So, these are obviously the terrible events that have spurred this idea of putting on an event like this. There's a personal connection here. My family roots go back to the Ukraine. I've never been to Ukraine, but two generations or three back, part of my family were small-scale farmers in the fertile soils of Ukraine. So that was kind of, part of the inspiration for organizing this as well. Millions of people have not just been displaced. The people trafficking gangs have been in full action, forcing boys, girls, women into dependent relationships, sometimes into prostitution. We've seen reports of that sort coming from not just Ukraine, but from Poland in particular, where millions of people have been stranded. All of this is very sad and terrible, of course, where on the back of very ordinary people, a great geopolitical game seems to be played. But, and it's a pretty big but, this is, of course, just the latest event of a series of events where violence is playing out under modern management, as it were. For those of you and those of us interested in history, we of course realize that the war in Ukraine is not a singular event. It's something that is happening all too often, and it's sometimes surprising that the field of business and management and organization studies is not better in reflecting about the dynamics of violence. There are only really a few papers and books that have been written on this, which I think is perhaps not surprising, given the hegemony of management thought is directed in towards other ends. But I invited the speakers. We have got an illustrious group of 8 speakers here, and invited those people who have reflected on violence, and specifically organized violence. And so some attempts have been made within our academic field to reflect critically about the dynamics of violence. But what these reflections have in common is this sense of that events like the Ukraine war masks really underlying dynamics that are going on in modernity itself. And that's the purpose of this webinar, to sort of step back, pause, and think about what's actually going on here. Yes, what's going on in Ukraine is terrible, but there is a need to reflect about the underlying dynamics of violence that seems to be all too familiar in a series of modern events. And when I say here modern, is there seems to be something in the way modernity is organized, and capitalist modernity in particular, that predicates this to basically lead to violence and industrial scales of violence making, let's put it that way. So to discuss this with me further today are, as I said, are 8 speakers from around the world, and I'm very grateful for them to join us here. I will introduce them as we go along. The first speaker is Dr. Maria Ehrnström-Fuentes, who is an assistant professor at Hanken School of Business in Finland. So we have about 10 minutes for each speaker. I will sort of give everyone a sign that their time is soon up. So if you could sort of try to keep to the 10 minutes, because we've got to go through quite a few speakers. And we also have time for discussion after each short presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, it's probably best to put it into chat, which I will then sort of try to summarize and read out to the presenters. So without further ado, because we've got quite a lot to go through, I hand over to Maria with her first set of reflections. Maria.
Thank you, Steffen. I will speak about from territories in Latin America, far away on the other side of the globe where I'm situated. But I do acknowledge that what I will speak about has also relevance for Europe and Ukraine. I will just mention that Europe signed a strategic partnership on natural resources for the digitalization and green transition, the critical raw materials needed for digitalization and the green transition in Europe, with Ukraine in July 2021. And so beneath what we are witnessing here right now is always the question of natural resources needed for the current economic practices in which we're all embedded. But from that, I would like to just jump over. I prepared a short text for today, and I will just take questions afterwards. So what I'm speaking about today is the modern ontology and its war on the pluriverse. And I would like to start with a quote from the systems thinker Fritjof Capra, who speaks of the multiple environmental and social and economic crises that humanity faces as a crisis of perception. I quote, "If you follow the river of these crises upstream, you meet a crisis of consciousness, a crisis of perception, a crisis of how we see ourselves and our role in this living planet." End of quote. Having worked for quite some time now in the intersection between the modern corporate world and indigenous peasant worlds, I would like to say that if you follow the river of these crises upstream, you will meet modernity and its ontological assumptions. These ontological assumptions are what stands at the center of the crisis of perception and what makes us continuously wage a war of extinction on the pluriverse. The pluriverse is a concept used by Latin American anthropologists Maria Blase, Marisol de la Querena, and Arturo Escobar as they discussed the ontological nature of conflicts over land, environments, and natural resources in indigenous territories in Latin America. This concept allows us to see that how we relate to land and nature really depends on our diverging assumptions about how the world works, and these assumptions also influence how we perform the world into being. The world doesn't exist out there, rather it is continuously performed into being, shaped by the world-making or life-making practices that sustains it. So drawing on Anne-Maria Moll's work of the body multiple, these scholars say that the world is a pluriverse that implies that it is multiple. The pluriverse, as an intellectual device, then allows us to see that the world does not exist as a singular unit out there, separated from us and our perspective of it. Rather, it is made of many different overlapping worlds that are continuously performed into being through different practices. and how these worlds are constantly threatened by modernity that continuously seek to conquer new territories. It's the dominance of the modern ontology, or the modern myth, as Mario Blasa would frame it, that makes us perceive the world as singular, where we humans are separated from nature, and thereby we can control it by knowing or measuring its functions. By separating ourselves from nature, we have been able to create monetary prosperity, shareholder values, and an ever-growing economy that is oblivious to the violent destruction that its ever-increasing need for natural resources pose on the larger web of life. The same modern myth also suggests that time is linear, or that the evolution of history follows an unquestionable linear development from poor, suffering, pre-modern societies towards advanced, affluent modern societies. This imposed linearity of the history of time has come to shape our language, our thinking, in such a massive way that we find it hard to acknowledge and appreciate all other ways of being on Earth that resist living by such linearity. Those that do not follow the path of modernity are deemed inferior, outdated, backwarded, and incapable of competing with all the seductive promises of salvation that the linearity of the modern myth has to offer. So these ontological assumptions that come with the modern myth are difficult to deconstruct, as they are so ingrained in how we view the world. This myth makes it very challenging to comprehend the relational features that exist in places inhabited by other ontologies. And while we are blinded by our own ontological assumptions, we will not notice how these assumptions are waging a war on the pluriverse. The war against the pluriverse is very visible in places where locals defend their way of being on the land against the threat posed by global corporations. As is expressed in the following quote by a Mapuche woman fighting the global forestry companies on her ancestral lands in Valmapo in southern Chile. When the Nengen leaves, your spirit dies. You no longer have your non-human brothers. You become Kunilaf or orphan, because the Newen left and is no longer there. The Newen got angry with you because you didn't defend it, because you let it go. In the Mapuche world, nothing is insignificant. Everything has transcendence. Everything exists in symbiosis, and if the Newen goes away, it creates an imbalance. In the Mapuche world, we are a totality. One without the other does not exist. If we continue to allow the foresters to continue to be our neighbors, knocking on the door of our house, what we are doing is that we are disappearing. We are committing suicide. How can we take into account entities such as the Newen that is threatened by forest plantations as something more than just spiritual beliefs or a cultural trait of indigenous cultures? How can we acknowledge the existence of an entity that is incomprehensible from our own ontological standpoint, but that shape the reality of others in very tangible ways? Entities such as the Newen of the forest are not just cultural and spiritual beliefs, nor are they social constructs of a world out there. They are part of the Mapuche world, and without the Newen, the Mapuche world ceased to exist. Ultimately, the war against the pluriverse is a war against ourselves. We are all relational beings that are nourished by the web of life that we ourselves are part of. Thus, acknowledging the existence of a pluriverse of worlds beyond modernity is what also can help us to reframe how we see ourselves and our role in the larger web of life. Acknowledging the existence of a pluriverse can help us move from a mentality of extraction towards a mentality of regeneration, supporting the life-giving features of the web of life instead of destroying it. And in the defense of the pluriverse, it's also important to acknowledge that how we as researchers refer to different non-modern realities and ways of being will either strengthen or weaken the possibility of pluriversal futures. Words are powerful tools that also enact ontological violence on other cultures. When we, through our words, label other non-modern ways of performing the world as pre-modern, subaltern, or even marginalized, we further strengthen the dominance of the modern myth in our perception of what is deemed real and possible in the here and now. Thank you. That was it.
Thank you, Maria. That was right on time. Thank you very much for that. We have time to voice any comments, questions, either via the chat or if you're brave enough to come in live. If you could maybe raise your hands, there's this button under reactions in Zoom where you can raise your hand. If anybody would like to say something, we've got a few minutes. Otherwise, we can also carry on and then have a more general discussion later. Just going to wait. Oh, somebody's raised their hand. Caroline, please.
Hiya, I just wanted to say, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say it was lovely. It was really captivating. And it speaks to a lot of the interest that I've been thinking about, mostly around post-humanism and the other, who is the animal, who is in fact part of us and not apart from us. And when we think about organised violence on the animal, that is responsible for all the pandemics that have come and are coming our way, as well as obviously climate change. So, you know, this separation from the non-human other is coming back to bite us. No pun intended, but it was lovely to listen to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else would like to say anything? Otherwise, we can store up thoughts and comments for later on. I wanted to ask, how do you link this violence to white supremacy? Adam Elsert asks on the chat. Have you got any thoughts on the violence of white supremacy, whatever is meant by that? I mean, that's quite a specific term. Any thoughts, Maria?
I think that it maybe was he said he was joining late, maybe it's a general comment to all of us, but I can just mention that in the theoretical framing of the dominance of the modern ontology, it is acknowledged that part of it is the colonial violence that come with the Eurocentric and white legacy of the dominance of the white man in the past, that makes the dominance so much stronger.
Okay. And Guido has pointed us to the work of Bruno Latour, who of course has done more than many other people to help us think about the problematic relationship of distinguishing between human and non-human actors, or actants, as he calls it, I think. The book, Guido, Gaia, the concept Gaia, is of course also related with the British ecologist, or physicist rather, I should say, James Lovelock. Any connection between these two concepts or different interpretations?
He continues the idea. That's what he writes in the book. So he refers to Lovelock.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular book. Okay, great. Well, I'll look that up. Maria?
Yeah, can I just add on that? And I think that Gaia is kind of also a universal construct in a way, and that what the pluriverse bring into the conversation is this place-based and inherited ancestral, local histories and ancestral inheritances that also impact ways in which people relate to the more than human world. And so it's not just, the web of life is not singular either, that it really depends on how people have have come to know, have come enmeshed in that web of life through different, their own myths that are passed through generations and through practices.
And we wouldn't expect anything else from Bobby but point to a critique of Latour, which he just posted, which of course is an important point to make. So yeah, click on that link, and then yeah, the variety of critiques of Latour, of course, and I have my own take on that, which I will not go into now. Okay, I think we'll move on. In fact, Bobby, you are the next speaker, if that's okay. If you would like to share your screen, you may.
I've decided not to use it. I just talk.
Okay, let me just then formally introduce you, Professor Bobby Banerjee, based at Base Business School, I think you're called now, in London, formerly CAS, one of the, well, let's not go into that, but I mean, Bobby has published quite a lot on various forms of organized violence, but you're talking to us from Mumbai at the moment. What you're doing there?
Different form of organized violence. No, here to see family. I had not seen because of COVID, and trying to finish up GCR of grant applications.
Okay, well, nice to have you with us. So yeah, over to you, Bobby, for your reflections.
Yeah. Right, I'll just put on the timer. Thanks for the invite, Stefan. Before I share my views, I was actually going to talk about some of my ongoing work on theorizing violence and war. And then I said, no, that's too boring. I was intrigued by the title of this session, Modernity, Unhinged, Organized Violence. There seems to be an assumption here that modernity has become unhinged because of the war in Ukraine, or at least the latest example of an unhinged modernity. And I want to challenge that. I argue that modernity has always been unhinged since its creation, because modernity is deeply embedded with the idea of empire, of colonial domination, whose mission involves political subjugation of those it seeks or sought to empower and civilize. So while triumphant European histories celebrate the Enlightenment and modernity as a liberating and progressive force, the histories of Black people, people of color, indigenous peoples that have borne the brunt of modernity tell slightly different stories. Stories of genocides, stories of colonial domination, of environmental destruction, of disease, of cultural devastation. So if you look at the narratives in the mainstream public sphere, it appears to me that modernity has become unhinged because white people are killing other white people, without a recognition that white people killing and dispossessing Black and brown people has always been constitutive of modernity through its colonial practices. So that's the kind of context I want to set the war in Ukraine. And like you, I'm sure, like I have, you must have received many petitions to sign condemning the war. And not one of those several petitions I've received acknowledges these contexts, right? So my question to myself is, why are European and North American institutions and governments asking me to condemn this particular war when those very same institutions are responsible for scores of wars and massacres of Black and brown civilian populations? So particularly galling was a statement which came to me by a group of vice chancellors and rectors of European universities, a group with the self-congratulatory name EUtopia, which claimed, and I quote, "We defend peace and European values that are incompatible with the imposition of power by violence." Really? Which fucking planet are these dudes living on? Imposition of power by violence is not just compatible with European values, it is very much a European speciality. How does one explain this historical amnesia or sanctioned ignorance? And it is the same colonial modernity on display when Condoleezza Rice, the former US Secretary of State, when asked if the invasion of Ukraine was a war crime, could look at the camera without batting an eyelid and a straight face say that any invasion of any sovereign state is a war crime. But of course, she would never admit that the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan are war crimes. So when is a war crime not a war crime? When it is done by a Western superpower. So the narrative about the war and violence in Ukraine is another form of violence, yeah, because of the erasures, the silences, the denials. So if Putin is a war criminal, then so are George W. Bush, Tony Blair, Barack Obama, and dozens of political leaders in Western liberal democracies over the years. Why do we stop at freezing the assets of Putin and his oligarchs? Who is going to freeze the assets of people like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, when the US and its allies indiscriminately bomb or invade countries? I'm sure you can see the profound hypocrisy here. Now, racism is another form of violence that is quite apparent in the Ukraine conflict. Apart from discrimination against African and Asian nationals fleeing Ukraine, the mainstream media's portrayal of the war is an example of how global, systemic, institutionalized racism and imperialism operate, particularly in the framing of Ukrainian refugees, in comparison with the framing of refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Africa. So when the CBS correspondent describes the war in Ukraine as, and I quote, "This isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European city." What happens then is Ukrainian refugees then are posed as more civilized, somehow superior to refugees from the Middle East, African or Asian nations. Therefore, their lives are worth saving, while the lives of millions of others who are seeking refuge are more disposable, because they are people who are not well-dressed, they're not middle class, they don't look like us. I mean, I don't mean me, look like me, look like us. I'm not the us here. Or who live in much more remote locations. This is not, I repeat, this is not an Eastern European problem with racism. It is a European problem with racism. Yeah. So let's leave Ukraine aside for the moment, right? So how is violence organized and deployed at the level of political economy? So I'm going to spend the remainder of my time talking very briefly about the practice of everyday violence, not just by the state, who's only the legitimate monopoly who have violence, but also the outsourcing of violence to private organizations to protect corporate assets. So I will briefly touch upon two cases to illustrate what I mean. The first is the everyday violence of occupation in the context of Palestine. And the second, the violence of extraction in the mining industry, where thousands of people are killed every year in what I call our subcontracted massacres, and communities dispossessed because of mineral extraction. In both these cases, legacies as well as ongoing structures of settler colonialism enable the deployment of violence that allows states to kill its own citizens with impunity. So Palestinians have endured and continue to endure different forms of violence. Direct, structural, instrumental, epistemic violence are part of their daily lives. Just give you some examples which I have personally witnessed during my travels in the West Bank, and I haven't seen in too many journal articles. From spraying Palestinian homes with skunk water, sewage water, basically shit and piss water. Your shirt and your clothes stink for weeks after that, right? Building illegal settlements, confiscating land using a variety of legal maneuvers, including applying laws that date back to the Ottoman Empire, controlling access to water and electricity, demolishing Palestinian homes, destroying citrus and olive trees, which is really a diabolical way they do this. It takes about 3 to 4 years for an olive tree to flourish and harvest. So they will wait till all the labor has been put in. Don't forget, it's a desert, right? Till the olive tree is just about to harvest, that's 3 years, and then they bulldoze it down, yeah? Using multiple checkpoints to restrict movement of Palestinians, arbitrary detention of trucks. I once passed a checkpoint and there was a truck parked in there at 5:30 in the morning. I came back after my work at 7 o'clock in the evening. It was still parked there in a blazing July sunshine. The moment the vegetables rotted, the checkpoint said, right, you can go. The entire, I mean, in what way is this vegetable seller a threat to the Israeli state, right? These are everyday violence. The list is endless. All this, of course, is in addition to more direct forms of violence, including targeted assassination, extrajudicial killings, which are also part of Palestinians' daily lives. And business plays a key role in dispossession and occupation. Some of this violence is subcontracted to private firms, and obviously much of the equipment used to carry this out is manufactured by companies. And as you may know, many of these businesses are the target of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Moving on to the case of the extractive industries, there are currently more than 1,400 violent conflicts in natural resource projects involving mining companies and communities, right? It is no coincidence that all these conflicts are happening in the former colonies. It is also no coincidence that all the multinational companies involved in these conflicts are from the former colonizer countries, yeah? And also all these countries are quote unquote democratic, which begs the question, in what way is democracy serving these communities who are being disposed and killed? How does a democratic state kill its own citizens with impunity to protect corporate assets? And the state is a key player in these conflicts because most of these mining projects are joint venture projects, which is the state. Direct colonialism in these countries may have ended. The white man may have gone, but colonial modes of extraction continue to operate with the native elites now doing most of the colonial administration. And I'll end with a recent example about the violence ongoing in the settler colonies of Australia, Canada, Latin America, New Zealand, the United States. The recent resistance movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline by the Standing Rock Sioux tribal nation is an example of how internal colonialism operates in contemporary liberal democracies. This $4 billion project was taking the pipeline through to Native American land, violating past treaties. The protests were violently quelled by private security forces and military police. Armed vehicles, rubber bullets, mace, water cannons, attack dogs, tear gas, concussion grenades, armed drones, and helicopters. It is difficult not to see the racialized nature of this violence in quelling tribal protests. I spoke at the Occupy Wall Street protests. I've been at some climate marches in the US. I have never seen these tactics deployed to suppress protests by white American citizens, right? The tribal leaders also pointed to the racial injustice of the project. The earlier proposal was to route the pipeline through a town called Bismarck. Bismarck is 92% white, and that proposal was rejected, and instead it was proposed that you pass the pipeline through Native American land, right? And business played a key role in suppressing dissent. So the owners of the pipeline, Energy Transfer Partners, hired the private security firm Tiger Swan to conduct surveillance of activists and provide daily briefs to US intelligence agencies, right? Now, when states and big business collude to become the legitimate providers of violence in a democracy, then that democracy must be questioned, right? So in the intersection of the political and the economic, it's necessary to exercise the right to kill, yeah, a space of letting die in the name of rationality and equilibrium of the market. And this organization of the violence is both racialized and gendered, which is why we see hundreds of thousands of women and men who are willing to put their bodies on their line to protect their livelihoods and their land. As I said, I was going to theorize this in the work I've done on necrocapitalism, but I'll let that go in case we have time for discussion. Thank you for your time and attention, folks.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you for these reflections. And as you said, you've written quite a lot on these things, so anybody can look up Bobby's work on necrocapitalism and beyond. So any comments and feedback, questions to Bobby? Anyone, please? Please come forward, raise your hand on Zoom, or put your question into the chat. Maria, please.
Hello, Bobby. I know you are well aware of the mining boom up here in Finland. And yes. Well, it's coming closer now to where I am as well. It's not just the Sami areas in the northern Finland that are under the threat. We also have some battery factories being planned, and with that they are promoting sustainable mining as there's access to lithium here in the region. And so my question to you is that you have built this on very much on the colonial legacy, and maybe we can also bring that into the debate if we are colonial here. But do you see a shift And is it now access to all, whatever, wherever it is? It doesn't depend on color anymore, or do you see that the violence still will remain in colonial settings?
Well, it depends on the context and the numbers. So if you're looking at sheer numbers and the histories, in terms of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, it dwarfs maybe one protest in Finland or Sweden that way. So I was looking in terms of the broader context. Now, I wasn't particularly talking about the oppression of the Sami people, but the point you make is an interesting one, that to save the planet now, we have to get lithium batteries and solar, okay? That continues the inequalities in that case. Driving an electric car is not going to save the planet. And what is unheard or unsaid in the mines which are going to mine lithium or batteries in other places, at the end of the supply chain for Tesla, yeah, is a 10-year-old kid in the Congo with a pickaxe taking out the cobalt or lithium. That is not pretty much apparent in any of the supply chain we see. So when looking at colonial context, yes, I'm looking specifically at the legacies in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. And perhaps in the case of Sami, it would be a similar context.
Probably not with underage minors, though.
No, because Europe is civilized, right? So that's not going to happen.
No, but the question is also whether here it's embraced as employment opportunities because there's not the experience of it. So is there also a shift because there is quite much awareness and resistance, and also people know that this is problematic?
Yeah,
to extract the mines there. So let's move them into the places where we can build more responsibility.
Yeah, I've seen some protests where they're trying to build renewable energy stuff on Sami land, and they're trying to negotiate. I mean, look, as you know, Maria, any land access, that it's not just about not having a mine. It's about what, especially in the poorer countries who are impoverished, what's the best deal we can get out of this, right? And history has shown that royalties and all the payments they get have actually added to the problem. Some groups, especially in Canada, are much better organized, and they refuse to negotiate with the government. They can say, you want to mine on land, you come and talk to us, right? So they have these interesting multiple governance apparatuses, but they're really very specific to local context. So what power exists of Canadian Aboriginal communities might not exist in other regions.
We've got 3 people having their hands up, so yeah. Let's hear from them. Yeah, Christina first, then Stefano, and then Mariana. Please, Christina.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for really great points that you brought up. I was just wondering if you believe this new initiative on the European Union side concerning corporate due diligence, which will establish civil liability, do you think it will make a difference? And if so, do you think it can be extended beyond the European Union, and to what effect?
Yeah, I was partly involved in the garment trade initiative they're trying to do. Look, all this is great, but at the end of the day, it's enforceability, right? It's you can have all these standards in place, but yes, I understand the European one is a bit more different. It has more teeth, but yeah, if I can get the enforcement, apparatus right, and that'll be fine. And also, let's not forget, it's more than just having a sustainable mine or a green mine, right? I know that's an oxymoron. The issue is, again, in terms of the benefits from that activity. How is that being shared, right? And the same thing with the garment industry in those following the Bangladesh factory collapse. The real elephant in the room is not worker safety or health and safety or having a fire extinguisher. The real elephant in the room is our fixation for cheap prices, right? So unless we're getting into that, is raise the price of the basic commodities so that you can have these measures in place, we're not going to go anywhere. So first of all, what I would like to see once this has been passed, I know some of it has been passed, is what are the enforceability mechanisms? And secondly, don't forget, it gets complicated. This is what happened in Bangladesh. They accused the green groups of colonialism. They say, you guys are rich, you want us to remain in poverty, right? And you want to meet all these standards, which we cannot meet because we are poor. So trying to interfere with another country's national regulation, which may be different from what the European Union wants is going to be, how shall I put it, quite tense, right? The only way to do this is to prevent access to European markets, right? And then there is maybe they'll take it to the WTO. So it becomes a real bit of a mess, is how you're going to actually enforce this.
Okay, we are sort of running a bit out of time here. So can we just have two very short, or Stefano, would you mind parking your question for later? Would that be okay, since you will be speaking later? Very short question, Mariana, because we sort of got to go through quite a few more presentations. Mariana?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much. No, just very quick question, really. And thank you very much, the speakers who presented and contributed. Just one question to Bobby. And I start from position that, I'm sorry, I'm not too well today, that colonialism is a crime. We can never tire of studying, and it's our main kind of duty as critical scholars, or scholars more generally. Having said that, I also think, Bobby, and that's kind of an important thing to say, that it is really the failed promise of modernity, as Pankaj Mishra will tell you, and also like feminists, Marxist feminists will tell you, it's actually dividing people, racializing them across, you know, ethnicity, class, etc., etc. That is the capitalist accumulation in you know, how it has proceeded. So I'm not denying anything about colonialism. Absolutely not. Obviously, I don't think I have to say that even. But I just want to say what Stefan has put actually in his box. So it's a capitalist mode of organizing. Yes, of course, you may say it's kind of Anglo-Saxon invention, but I think actually it has colonized the minds of elites, and not just elites, even non-elites across the world. So that's the big problem for me. Thank you. Sorry if I took too much time.
Can we just leave that as a comment for now? Is that all right, Bobby?
Yep. No, I wasn't going to respond anyway. So yeah.
Okay, great. Let's move on. Thank you, Mariana, for your intervention there. All good, food for thought. So let's move on. Our next speaker is Professor Jana Costas. She's based at the Europa-Universität Viadrina, Frankfurt, Oder. It works to be a German in this instance. But talking to us from Berlin, I believe. Welcome, Jana, and straight over to you. Thanks for joining us.
So, okay, you must be able to see my screen now.
Yes, yeah? All good.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk today. And I felt a bit like Bobby, thinking, do I actually want to talk about my research? So I would try to do both, to say something about the Ukraine and to say something as well about the research I've conducted with others on violence. And so what I'm going to present is built on conversations both with Philip Arnold and Anna Prochorova, who are also here, I think, in the Zoom event. And it builds on two articles I've wrote, one with Chris and one I'm currently writing with, or have developed with Philip. So I want to start actually and reflect a bit of what's happening in the Ukraine, because it did impact us quite a lot here in Berlin or in Germany more generally. And Jürgen Habermas, who I'm sure all of you are familiar with, recently published an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung on the Ukrainian war, or we should say the Russian attack on Ukraine in the West's Red Line dilemma. And what I thought was interesting is the very start of his article, which is 77 years after the end of the Second World War and 33 years after the end of a fragile peace maintained only through a delicate balance of terror, disturbing images of war have returned, right outside our door and unleashed arbitrarily by Russia. And I have to say, I'm one of those, lucky people born in the early 80s that overall, yes, I've lived my life more or less through fragile peace. Having said that, I still remember, for example, the Yugoslavian wars. And of course, Bobby has mentioned many other wars that have gone, that also Europe was involved or that took place even within the realms of Europe. So it's interesting that Habermas makes it seem as if we have even lived in such peace for 33 years. But I think what is this? This is indicative, and Bobby also already pointed this out, and this is maybe something I also want to basically emphasize, of the idea that we are here witnessing something that is basically absurd, as the Antonio Guterres, in fact, mentioned when he, as a UN Secretary General, went to visit the Ukraine. Now, why would this war be absurd, as terrible as it is? And I think it can only be seen as absurd if we understand modernity as non-violent. And that goes back to Bobby's point about, has modernity ever been non-violent? And is not violence very much inscribed into modernity? But I'm not going to go more into this direction. What I'm going to say more about, which I think is also interesting for us to think about, what does this tell us about our societies and how our societies, and when I say our now, I mean the German society, maybe what we define as the Western societies, understand themselves as violence averse, as free of violence. So the idea is that we have overcome some kind of violence. And how have we overcome it? Because now the state is, we have the state monopoly of violence, so we very clearly distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate violence, and we have this idea that we are civilized, and so violence is basically no longer appears. And so, to pick up also Bobby's point, so violence is approached as something uncivilized, as something of the past, and something non-Western. And I think these assumptions are problematic. They're problematic in two ways. First of all, they're problematic because they make it seem as if violence is absent in our societies. But second of all, and that's an interesting debate, and I will come back to this in relation to Habermas as well, it makes it, or it has led to a lot of debates in Germany, to what extent do we are open to violence when it's used as a form to counter an attack. And so these are these two things, I think, that are somehow interconnected with our understandings as violence averse and as against, therefore, also violence. Now, starting with the first problem, the idea that since, we have no longer violence, is that we make it kind of as absent, as the other, as something that is not happening here in our societies. Now, I will read now David Graeber's work on this. He has written on this in the Utopia of Rules. One thing I should maybe mention is that, of course, the violence I'm going to talk about in the midst of my society, or what David Graeber talks about, we cannot, it's not comparable to the kind of violence we see in wars and what's happening in the Ukraine right now and in other parts of the world. Nevertheless, I would say it's important to also use the notion of violence here precisely as not to reinforce this idea that we have overcome violence and violence is something we have nothing to do with. Now, let me quote, and let me read out this quote from David Graeber. And he writes in his book, so impersonal rules and regulations in turn can only operate if they are backed up by the threat of force. And indeed, in this most recent phase of total bureaucratization, we have seen security cameras, police scooters, issues of temporary ID cards, and men and women in a variety of uniforms acting in either public or private capacities, trained in tactics of menacing, intimidating, and ultimately deploying physical violence appear just about everywhere. All this takes place as social theorists continue to insist that the direct appeal to force plays less and less of a factor in maintaining structures of social control. The more reports one reads, in fact, of university students being tasered for unauthorized library use, or English professors being jailed and charged with felonies after being caught jaywalking on campus, the louder the defiant insistence, the kinds of subtle symbolic power analyzed by English professors are what's really important. It begins to sound more and more like a desperate refusal to accept that the workings of power could really be so crude and simplistic as what daily evidence proves them to be. So what David Graeber here points out, it's not just the fact that people in society or organizations don't see how violence is still part and parcel of the way in which social control takes place. It's also a problem that we as researchers have by the very theories we use, by the very lens we take on, for example, organizations. And so building on that, I think it is important, and this has been, part of my efforts also with the article with Chris, to bring into focus violence. And here I want to say something which might sound a little bit controversial given the talks we had before. I would call for a more narrow understanding of violence, namely violence that is about physical violence. So for example, for me, violence, the physical violence, should not be equated with symbolic violence. Why? Because following the sociologist Collins, there's a particular emotional field of tension and fear involved when you talk about physical violence. It's about the body. And also as Popitz, a German scholar, said, the body is in that sense, we as humans, the body is always with us. So when we are attacked, when we're physically attacked, it does something with us if we want it or not. And therefore, on the one hand, I'm calling for a more narrow understanding of violence in terms of the physicality, which doesn't mean that it does not interrelate with symbolic violence, but I think it still has a different quality. And I think it's important to be here precise, because otherwise we invisibilize precisely this kind of physical violence, which is also taking place. And at the same time, with Collins, I think it's important to look at the way, and also as David Kleber points out, in which violence is both about the actual use of violence as well as the potential use, and both by state and non-state actors. So the kind of violence, for example, David Kleber discusses, works precisely by signaling the potential use of violence. And it's this, I think, that we should study across organizational settings. And I've done so with Philip Arnold with respect to security guards and their practices of violence in a refugee arrival center. But I think it's also interesting to study violence, and that is now the second point I wanted to get to, as a form to defend, as a form to counter violence. And that is something that Anna from the Ukraine is working on when it comes to the Maidan social movement and how violence was framed there. And this leads me then to the last point, namely, how do we as scholars of violence want to position ourselves? So I think what's happening right now in the Ukraine raises important ethical questions about our stance vis-a-vis violence, vis-a-vis the military. And in Germany, these debates are very much going on. So in terms of, should we send weapons to the Ukraine to be able to defend itself or not? And what kind of weapons? And at what point are we sending weapons that might increase a certain way in which the war is going and the kind of violence we see there? And at what point does it become actually ethically wrong? And this is, I think, a question which, I don't have perfect answers onto that, but I think one thing that we should look at is what are, the Ukrainians saying about this themselves. And Anatoly Yermolenko, who is a Ukrainian philosopher, responded to Habermas in the piece just recently in the same newspaper by saying, can we talk with those at the moment they kill and destroy you? Unfortunately not. It is difficult to lead a dialogue, more so in argumentative discourse, when you're being shot at and your cities are being bombarded. So yeah, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jana. Thank you. A different take on the topic. So any comments, questions, feedback by anyone, please step forward. Katerina, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Jana, for sharing with us your thoughts. And basically what I wanted to ask about this violence, you mentioned this physical and I think also digital violence, if I'm not mistaken. But how do you think is actually COVID-19 pandemic considered also kind of a sort of violence, or kind of maybe the restrictions, imposed restrictions in some countries were kind of also considered as a source of violence to the people? And regarding also, for example, to misinformation, disinformation, is it also kind of, violence that is caused by information. I don't know, I have many questions in mind because I'm also doing research now in context of Ukraine, and I'm also a researcher from Ukraine, but I've been living in Finland. But these questions kind of are raised in my hand during your presentation. Thank you.
Well, it's very, very difficult to say. I mean, with regards to COVID-19, I mean, one of the things that I found very interesting, and it's still the case, is the kind of diffusion of violence to non-state actors. And then maybe Stefano and others might also talk about this. But so the idea that suddenly we have security guards everywhere, yeah? And that they become a kind of normal part of most shops you went to, at least in Germany, to every grocery shop you went to, there was a security guard. And security guards, of course, they stand there in order to show, okay, if you don't follow the rules, I'm going to physically, I'm going to physically do something with you. So that for me was a sign, and there's a sense of violence. Now, in terms of digital violence and information violence, I would be more skeptical. I think we can use other terms for that. I think it's important to, violence is for me about their bodies involved. There's physicality.
But also emotional, it can affect some people, like let's say Russians and Ukrainians now, and like even in these digital channels, there is also lots of violence going on, that your rights are, for example, are not protected anymore. Your information can be like taken away from some sources, of channels that you are following, or like you are part of some groups. So I feel that, this topic of information security is rising now, like huge, and about the information sharing, and can I trust this information or not? And so there is also
but for me this is very different than talking about physical violence. So this is not about bodies that are being potentially made to suffer.
Okay, I think that point is very clear. So can we ask Richard and Maria to ask two very short questions or comments, because we need to move on, I'm afraid. Richard?
Thank you. Thank you, Jana, and thank you all the presenters. Howard Kegel has been doing some really interesting writing about the debates within the ANC, the African National Congress, during a time when they were considering whether to drop their total rejection of violence in resistance to the apartheid regime, and your mention of violence and the Maiden made me think of that. If you haven't seen Howard Kegel's work on resistance, I really recommend it. It's great stuff. Thank you, Jana.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's leave that as a comment, if that's all right. Maria, very quick one, if you may.
Yes, just quickly. What I was talking about was not symbolic violence. It's a violence against existences and ontologies, entire worlds in which people live. So I think that was the point I was trying to make. The other thing, I think that it's very difficult to say that something is physical and not physical, because where do you draw the line? In the case of the Mapuche resistance to forestry companies, they become very violent physically, and jail and death as an outcome, because when the people organize resistance. But before that, you cannot see it, but it's still there. So I think that it's very problematic to divide in between also, because they are interlinked.
Can I say something to that?
Just briefly, please.
No, but that was my whole point. So there is and of course, there is something like potential violence, to me, is part of violence, but there's still a difference between whether the potential violence is targeted and makes the potential victim also feel that it goes against their body, against their, them, and it involves a certain kind of fear of life, where they feel a threat of themselves, or not. And I think, of course, we have to look at case by case, but if we now, as scholars, make it so broad and we talk about everything as violence, I think precisely then we invisibilize the actual violence that's taking place. So there is no clear-cut answer, but at the same time, I would call us to not have such a broad understanding of violence, because I think it actually reinforces the very invisibilization of violence that is taking place here also in our society. So that would be my response to that. Okay. Yeah, threat of violence is for me part of violence. So that when I'm reading this in the chat. Okay, we have to.
Sorry, I'm really, really sorry.
I'll take it later.
I'm fully aware of the potential violence exercised here as host, but we do need to move on. Otherwise, it'd be unfair for the following speakers. So so thank you, Jana. Thank you very much. We're going to move to Sama Abdelnour, who's senior lecturer in strategic management at the University of Edinburgh. So Sama, over to you.
Thank you, Stefan, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here with all these fantastic colleagues. So when challenged to think about organized violence, I decided to draw on a couple of pieces that I've written, two pieces for two different audiences. The first is a conceptual framework that I proposed to a community of Palestinian thinkers, published in a Palestinian think tank, Al-Shabaka, about 9 years ago, called Beyond South Africa, Understanding Israeli Apartheid. And it was an attempt to challenge that community of thinkers to think beyond the legal definition of apartheid as to something that is a system of organized violence. And I think it's becoming more relevant to organizational scholars, and I've been toying with that once again. The second was a recent publication in Organization about researching violent context, which was a reaction to kind of a growing body of work, often labeled extreme context, that studied the feelings and the experiences of people who've witnessed violence, often people embedded in forces who've committed atrocious acts of violence, but claiming that that somehow represents a study of violent context. So it's a contextual, a historical work that this paper was written in response to. In terms of the conceptual framework, there are three elements, and I'll touch upon them briefly. Bobby kind of did the work for me of laying out the first element, which is the physical. I'll also speak about the architecture, but also ideology, and it really touches on other work Jana and others have mentioned. So the physical faces of apartheid, or I'll challenge you to think about this as a broader framework that could be used to understand violence more generally. And those are those interface elements that are more readily apparent and visible. They come in the form of what we often call violence and destruction. It's concrete and metal, it's checkpoints, it's settlements, settler roads, tanks, bombs, drones, those things that we can kind of see. And it also includes permit systems and techniques of classification and categorization. And some of the discussion around governmentality touches a bit on this, but more so on the architecture. These physical elements enact the violence that governs people's lived experiences. In the case of Palestinians, it's under military occupation and also exile. And we know quite a lot about this dimension. It's the dimension that horrifies us. It captures our attention. It can be counted and classified, and it also can be widely shared through media and social media. And although this element of violence tends to capture our attention, it's also important to investigate the architecture that both produces, sustains these. And so by architecture, I refer to the regulatory, political, and economic elements of apartheid or violence. These can be extremely elusive. They cut across multiple sectors, and connections between them are often unclear. So for example, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about Israel's weapons industry and the way that Palestinians are used as a captive population for the testing and development of weapons, but also the way Israel's booming tech and startup sector is really intimately wedded to military technology, and more high-level things like the NSO groups surveillance software is just an example of this. So this startup culture that's deeply intimately tied to the surveillance, the control, the subjugation, the murder, and extraction of resources of subjugated populations, I think is something that as organizational researchers we can go a long way to unpack. So this kind of comprehensive mapping of this architecture of violence requires, and as has been already discussed, in articulating the relationships between institutions, legal institutions, between corporations, between the startup sector, between civil society, etc. Such investigations may prove challenging and disturbing because of the extreme level of integration. So for example, in the case of Palestinians and Israelis, though the physical elements by their very nature convey separation and convey oppression, the architecture can actually be the opposite. Palestinians use the Israeli shekel. Palestinian communication sector, financial sectors, ultimately, and all trade regulated by Israelis. There are many Palestinians who work on Israeli settlements, and what many people don't realize is they're often people who've been dispossessed from the lands that those settlements are built. They've lost their livelihoods. In a sense, they're forced into this labor relation where they end up working. And so there's this kind of deeper level of integration that I think the architecture warrants examination. But underpinning all of these, and it's been touched upon in this group, is the ideology. And it's the ideology that enables, legitimates the enactment of violence, whether it's state or non-state actors. So, you know, racism is a clear one. We talk about colonialism, but at some level, violence requires the dehumanization of the other to an extent that we can legitimate that violence. And if we look at this framework in the context of gun violence in the US, and you know, and the idea that people have a right, there's this so much kind of ideological tension in the way that you know, people have a right to own arms, or the way you know, evangelical Christians in the US really are fighting for guns, and the way different ideologies sometimes clash, but sometimes overlap in interesting and unique ways. But my argument in this piece to the colleagues that I wrote for was that ideology is, we need to take it into more critical interrogation. And an example of this in the context of Palestine-Israel, where many of you might remember there were massive protests in 2011 in Tel Aviv, where Israelis in the tens of thousands took to the streets demanding justice and equality, mostly for refugee and marginalized populations, but none of that extended beyond the line towards Palestinians. So there was this strong expression of social justice, taking care of the marginalized populations, but the line was drawn, it did not. So there's this kind of ideological, ideology also blinds in a way that it also enables certain sets of agency, but it also blinds. So beyond, other than that piece, I wanted to, so one other thing is that architecture is also challenging with, for instance, things like dual use technology, which the EU is looking as a new market area for growth. And what is dual use technology? It's technology that is both has civilian and military application. And this makes things complicated because our own business schools, our own companies that we invest in are often have relationships with organizations. So Boeing is a classic example. It's a company that produces weapons, but also produces airplanes and other technologies. Honeywell is one of the leading arms producers as well, but does a lot of other types of activities. And so this is another area where I think where we need to think a little bit more deeply about the production of violence. It's not simply that there are armed companies and other companies that are not arms companies. Increasingly, that line is really collapsing, and it probably always has been. The latter piece that I wanted to talk about was a recent publication around the idea of political reflexivity, and it begins by suggesting that violent contexts are not normal settings within which we can simply think about and write about and enter into and do research. And they're not normal because the work that we do, the research we do, the field work we can do, our publications can actually cause incredible harm to communities that are most marginalized by violence. And those harms come in the form of objectification, violence normalization, and also silencing voices. And that was also touched upon by some of the earlier speakers. And what my colleague and I argue in this piece is to better understand violent context, but also to avoid harms, we need to think more deeply about issues of privilege, about positionality and epistemic privilege. And we draw here on feminist standpoint theorists. And the most important to this, and I think the most ignored in a lot of literature when we're theorizing violence, is the issue of epistemic privilege. And what is that? It is the knowledge, it is the expertise, and recognizing the expertise of people who are most marginalized by violence, and recognizing and appreciating and respecting that people who are most marginalized by violence are the experts of their own condition. And what feminist standpoint theorists would argue, and we draw on work like Dorothy Smith and others, is that our research concerns, our theories, the direction of our research should begin with this epistemic privilege. And if it does not, we risk actually being complicit in the production of knowledge that reinforces or maintains violent context. But if we do, we can actually produce work that seeks to more fundamentally challenge and unseat and unsettle that. And so one of the things, I'll just tie it back to something Bobby mentioned, and then I'll close. And there's a lot of debate around, for instance, the Palestinian boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And whether or not people agree with sanctions or not, or boycott or not, that is a point of debate or discussion. However, if we take the point of epistemic privilege and we respect that, we should understand that people who are most victimized and marginalized by violence, and if we respect their intelligence, that they understand their condition and they also understand and are able to articulate what they need. And so we may have a debate about boycotts or sanctions or whatnot, but when an entire people stand up and say, this is our demand, this is what we need to take that more seriously. And I think we need to take that perspective more seriously overall in the work that we do. Now, that paper was a challenge to writers who are far less thoughtful than this group, in my view, are far less politically reflexive than this group. So I hope I'm not offending anyone by this work, but I'll close there, and looking forward to your comments, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Sama. Thanks very much. Again, the offer to provide comments, feedback, ask questions. Over to you. Richard?
Just quickly, Sama, what's your view of Sumud as a form of resistance in Palestine?
Thanks, Richard. So for those who you don't know, Sumud is a kind of, Sumud translate to steadfastness, and it's a kind of a discourse that emerged quite strongly in the first and second intifadas, where Palestinians sought to sustain themselves. And so Sumud ideologically is this, I think, ties strongly to resilience, maybe less so resistance, although it was tied very well to kind of community-based organizing education, underground education networks for schools when universities and primary schools were shut down by the Israelis for 5 years, organizing local cooperatives of production, hiding cattle in different farms for milk production to be able to get children milk and things like that. So I think it's, some people present it as a resistance strategy. In my view, it's more of a kind of a resilience and survival strategy, but it's something that is, I think, uniquely Palestinian in its origin and strongly tied to resisting occupation. And that certainly is in that piece on apartheid. I mentioned Samud as part of an ideology of, because it's, as Bobby mentioned, it's not simply about violence, it's also about counter-violence and counter-movements. Anyways, thanks, Richard, for that. My hand signal isn't working. Can I just have literally 30 seconds to comment on that, Stefan? It's related to his point. Yeah, it's as Simon said, it's uniquely Palestinian. I just want to get some caution in using the term resilience. It's now becoming de rigueur. Resilience is a sellout. It is a complete cop-out by the state, by the market, by civil society. These guys are screwed, but they're so resilient, you know. So we won't kind of need. So we've got to be very careful that that is not hijacked by the so-called donors to say that, oh no, these are resilient communities, they'll manage. You know, so whereas Samud is not, as Simon said, is a bit more complex than that, because it's got a lot more grassroots stuff happening. But there is a real danger, I think, I don't know if you agree with me, Simon, of it being captured with a larger resilient discourse. Thanks, Bobby. I do. And one of the things that I've been frustrated in with a lot of the entrepreneurship literature that's coming out in violence is, you know, there's a survival bias. Literally, people who have not been murdered by bombs, by soldiers, who've not been debilitated, we too quickly put the label of resilience on those. So absolutely agree with you, Bobby.
Okay, folks, we are running a bit behind, as I'm sure you've noticed. So I've already talked to the last speaker, Stefano, to warn him that he might have to be prepared to stay on, which he's happy to do. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to move on, really. Don't like to sort of cut your time short, Sama, but if there are no further sort of comments or questions, I'd like to move on, really. Thank you ever so much for all the speakers so far. We've got 4 more to go. I mean, you know, it's quite a lot to go through. So, but you know, there's a very interesting discussion going on the chat, responding still to Jana's intervention. So it goes to show that, you know, we do need to discuss this, and you know, the things are not clear at all. They're fuzzy. They're different definitions of violence. There are different dynamics of violence. There's a lot to consider. So I just wished we, in the wider field of organization management, business studies, we would do a lot more of that, because it's so much at the heart of what's going on, really, but often masked and hidden, of course. Okay, so we'll now go to the south of Brazil. Professor Maria Ceci Misoczky is based at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil. Nice to have you with us, Maria Ceci. Over to you.
Thanks, Steffen. It's very nice to be with you again, and some of the guys. And well, thanks. So I'll be very brief, and I want to tell you about what's happening in Brazil. We are very touched by, well, I will go and tell you. In Brazil, in just 6 of the 27 states, every 4 hours, a Black person is murdered by the police. This is a clear evidence of a racist policy of systematic assassination organized by the state apparatus. It is an organized order in which the police kill and the justice system buries the death, with public prosecutors avoiding any kind of responsibilities besides blaming the victims. The assassinations are legitimized under the so-called war against drugs policy. We can adapt Stuart Hall's concept of moral panic. According to Hall and co-authors, the moral panic created a diversion away from the wider economic crisis, Black youths out of control being the headlines rather than capitalism in crisis, hence the title of the book of 79, Policy in the Crisis. The authors applied the concept of moral panic, originally by Stanley Cohen, on the way how the English press connected mugging with race, and how the Black community of London was presented as a danger to law, order, and the British way of life, making the issue seems much more serious, dangerous, and definitely much more oriented towards racial hate. Back to Brazil, I can illustrate with two killings that happened recently in Rio de Janeiro peripheries. On May 24th, a few days ago, 26 people were murdered by the police in the Vila Cruzeiro favela. It comes 1 year after the raid of the Jacarezinho favela left 28 people dead in a repetition of abuse and summary executions. Even if there were arrest warrants, and there were only 5 warrants and 26 executions in Vila Cruzeiro. And of course, a warrant is not the equivalent of a death sentence. What we have is an organized policy of genocide against the Black poor population of the periphery of capitalism in the periphery of the cities. Moral panic and institutionalized racism are key components to naturalize these events as part of everyday life. It's now not very different than the description provided by Frantz Fanon almost a century ago. He wrote, "The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the Negro village, the Medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there. It matters little where or how. They die there. It matters not where nor how." In contemporary Brazil, we can affirm that Black meat is the cheapest meat in the market. The other face of systematic killing of Black people by the state apparatus is systematic incarceration. Brazil has the 3rd largest prison population in the world after the USA and China. In 2019, 66.7% of the prisoners were Black. From 2005 to 2019, the number of Black persons incarcerated increased 378%. The explanation is the interpretation of an anti-drugs law implemented in 2006, which has an obvious target. Before you ask, is this Bolsonaro's fault? No. Lula's words in 2007, after a raid in Rio left 19 people dead, were, "You don't face bandits with roses." It's worst under Bolsonaro, probably. Will it be different if Lula wins? No. Why not? Even if Lula comes as a radical different president with radical different alliances, which will definitely not be the case, it would be necessary a confrontation with the structures and institutions that would demand much more than political will. To briefly address this issue, I bring to this conversation a Brazilian Marxist Black author, Clovis Moura. The thought of Clovis Moura contributed to the reconstruction of the Black as a political subject. In his writings of the 70s and 80s, he reconstructed Black praxis as part of the conflictual integration of Black people in the periphery of capitalism and developed a key category, Black praxis, in the interpretation of Marxism from the perspective of Black anti-racist struggles. Clovis Moura explains that the Brazilian Black population occupies a place of marginalization, poverty, discrimination, and social rejection that can only be understood as a result of the relationship between the social division of labor and the racial division of labor. In other words, racism has been determinant for the preservation of Black workers at the marginal fringes of the dependent capitalist structure of labor. He also shows the existence of a strategy by the dominant racist class that includes regulatory and repressive mechanisms with the aim of fixing the Black poor population at this marginal fringe of the labor market, including the identification of them with criminality, the moral panic, killings, and incarceration. As a result, not only the white population, but middle-class Black people and the few upper-class Black people blame the poor Black population for the economic, social, and cultural situation they are, despising them, and as a result, they can be murdered with only a few localized protests taking place. To conclude, capitalism as a social relation produces and reproduces racism. Criminalization, incarceration, and extermination are strategies of social control that continuously reorganize Brazilian capitalist sociability, reproducing and deepening relations of production based on overexploitation of labor. The organized policy of racist domination puts Black poor population in a condition of extreme vulnerability, exposed to the worst conditions of labor and to all sorts of organizing violence, including death. I chose to share with you this, I think, not very known situation of the Black poor population in Brazil. It doesn't mean, of course, that there's no struggle, there's no Black praxis, there's not a growing anti-racist struggle in the country. But I thought that this was a very good opportunity to share this information that tends to be covered by the myth of the racial democracy and to I don't know, more I don't know how to say, the world talks about Bolsonaro, but doesn't talk about what is happening in everyday life with the poor population, Black population, talk about Amazon, talk about forests, talk about indigenous population, but hardly mentions what is happening in the peripheries of the cities where there is a massacre going on. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Ceci. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any comments, questions, feedback for Maria Ceci, please? Maria, please.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing this up here and trying to make sense of it in a way also. It is also just what you see now in Brazil, or can it be also witnessed in other South American countries? Do you know? Because I know that violence has gone up a lot also in Santiago during the past 2 years. So I'm wondering, is this just Brazil because of the political situation there, or can you see it elsewhere?
Maria, when I was thinking what I was going to talk, I thought that I could talk about Latin America in a wider, maybe talking about Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. But these are very different contexts of organized violence. So of state organized violence, that is what I was talking about. You know, these are murder states, you know, genocide states in different senses. So because these are very different contexts, and because Vila Cruzeiro happened a few days ago, so I chose to talk about Brazil. So I cannot say at this moment in 2 minutes anything else about Chile. But yes, it's worth to talk about Chile and Colombia at least because, you know, very, very dramatic circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Any questions, comments, feedback, please? Okay. If it's okay with you, Maria Ceci, we'll move on to the next one. Okay. So next we have Professor Guido Palazzo, who's based at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. Over to you, Guido.
Thanks, Steffen. And it's a bit difficult to follow up on Maria after these horror stories because I'm talking about something completely different from what we have discussed so far, which seems maybe banal on the surface, but is probably connected to what we have heard so far. I want to talk about violence inside organizations, especially inside large corporations. Maybe some of you know that since a while already, I'm devoted to analyzing corporate scandals and why scandals happen and what's going on in companies before they explode in a scandal. And there was something that at the beginning I didn't see, and that only, I would say the last 2 or 3 years came to my awareness. And I brought you 5 cases to illustrate this. And what I'm trying to show today is that whenever there's a big scandal of corruption, of whatever it is, of Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, crime on customers, whatever the scandal is, behind this scandal in the background, there's a particular cultural constellation. There's a culture of violence. And it's just not just a culture of violence, it's a celebrated and normalized culture of violence. And I would like to use these 5 cases to just give you a few quotes of people from inside these organizations before I then, in 1 or 2 minutes, try to indicate what I think is driving those cultures of violence. If we start with Volkswagen, this is the famous Volkswagen CEO who saved Volkswagen from bankruptcy, and who was not only a brilliant engineer, he was known for being a psychopath and a very brutal one. The CEO of General Motors once asked him, how do you achieve these precise body fits of your cars? These are the body fits. So this is a signal of great engineering art if you are able to do this perfectly in parallel. This is how Tesla looks like. So it's not that well done. And Bob Lutz obviously was not able to do that. So he asked that question. And this is what PH answered. I give you the recipe. I called all the body engineers, stamping people, manufacturing executives into my conference room. And I said, I'm tired of all these lousy body fits. You have 6 weeks to achieve world-class body fits. I have all your names. If you do not have good body fits in 6 weeks, I will replace all of you. Thank you for your time today. The guy who was in charge of Volkswagen during this Dieselgate scandal was a mentoree of Fed and PH. His name was Martin Winterkorn, and the German news magazine wrote an article about him and his leadership style 2 years before the scandal erupted. And that is what they say in a nutshell in this article. This is North Korea minus the concentration camps. So these guys had a terror regime in which if you would tell them, I have a problem, you would be fired, in which there was total obedience to what the leaders would say, pretty much like North Korea. If we go into Wells Fargo, you probably all know Wells Fargo is the story of thousands of bank people, salespeople committing fraud on their own customers. A few quotes. I had managers yelling at me. The sales pressure was unbearable. Managers discussed daily sales targets 4 times a day, at 11, at 1, at 3, at 5, yelling at them if they were not achieving their targets. I started to have extreme physical stress-related symptoms as well as random panic attacks. There were numerous days where I would hide in the men's bathroom crying. Amazon. Losers leave or are fired in annual cullings of the staff. It's called purposeful Darwinism. You walk out of the conference room and you'll see a grown man covering his face. Nearly every person I worked with, I saw cry at their desk. One time I didn't sleep for 4 days straight. France Telecom. A scandal of almost 100 people either killing themselves or trying to kill themselves within 3 years because of a redundancy program of the company. For them, I am nothing but an incompetent and cumbersome piece of shit. I was exposed to management by terror. I killed myself because of France Telecom. This is the only reason, one of the victims. My job is hurting. I can't stand this job and France Telecom doesn't care. Today, I was despised, insulted, yelled at. I called for help. People don't care. For people who are not proactive enough, you have to pull away the chair. That is the CEO speaking. Pull away the chair. When I took up my duties, I was surprised to find that I was isolated from all my work and without all my files, and that I was placed alone at a desk designed for 4 people located in a corridor. Another guy who killed himself. Uber, maybe the most recent scandal. Being cutthroat and competitive was considered an asset, not a liability. Kill or be killed was the unofficial motto at Uber, where if you weren't watching your back, you might be betrayed by a colleague looking to get ahead. Almost every single one of my colleagues had started seeing a therapist for anxiety or depression related to the culture of work at Uber. The engineers who've been at Uber the longest all seem to have suicidal thoughts. I was not prepared to deal with the abuse and dehumanizing treatment received from my superiors and colleagues at Uber. Uber finally broke me by destroying my dignity as a human being. I'm currently looking into plenty of other scandals, Boeing, Theranos, and I could endlessly continue that list. Behind all these scandals, you find extremely violent cultures. But violence that is not just, as I said, tolerated, it's celebrated as part of how these companies perceive good leadership. What's behind all that? Well, in my view, and maybe that's many things going on here, but the key element of all these stories is this. It's something that Jack Welch introduced at General Electrics when he became the CEO, and that became the norm in companies. It's the idea that we should evaluate people along a Gaussian distribution curve and separate them into high, low, and average performers, which as such is probably not an issue. It becomes an issue if you combine it with what we have introduced in the Western world as an ideal, meritocracy. Meritocracy means if you invest the effort and if you are clever, you will succeed. But if you succeed only because someone else does not succeed, you turn this into zero-sum meritocracy. And this is what you find in all these companies. And this is what the New York Times, with regards to Uber, has called an Hobbesian organization. If I know that if I am put on this curve as a low performer, I will be fired. I will be humiliated. I will do whatever it takes to survive. It's a Darwinistic Hobbesian culture in which people react in three ways, and there are three forms of violence that come out of this. The first one is violence against themselves. They kill themselves, suicide. There are suicides at Uber, suicide at Wells Fargo, suicides especially at France Telecom. Second, they turn the violence against their peers, their colleagues. And they try to stab even their superiors to get their position. It's everyone against everyone. And third, they turn against other stakeholders, like customers at Wells Fargo. So whenever there is this super high pressure context, the zero-sum meritocracy, violence results from that, and violence sooner or later drives rule breaking. So for me, this is an harassment is always an indicator that something else is going on, that something else soon will happen in this organization, which is pretty much related to compliance risks. So this is where I am with my little project, and that is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you. And maybe if I can add one point, if I take Jana's difference between symbolic and physical violence, I guess it's super difficult in this case to separate, because in some cases it's symbolic, you get humiliated. In other cases, you kill yourself. And the transition between these two is not so easy to understand.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you very much for these insights from inside the corporate world. Any comments, feedback, and questions to Guido? Please raise your hands now or put something in the chat. Chris is asking a question. Do you plan to present this concept to the business community in any way? Well, you're a well-published author. I guess you're writing this up, Guido?
This will be a book, yes. A book on corporate scandals.
Okay. And I guess Chris is asking, have you presented this sort of, inside the corporate world as well?
I do this all the time. I've told the Volkswagen guys when they asked me to do a workshop for their top management after the scandal that they had a psychopath culture, and I do the same in other companies. So, and they agree. I just don't know how to get out of it.
Okay, we've got three hands up. Sahira first, please.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Guido. Thank you so much for that. So very widespread phenomenon. There is a lot of stuff in investment banking, I'm sure about this, that you know about. Are you incorporating that? And also Netflix, the cutthroat culture on Netflix. I don't know if you're looking at that, but huge amount of, they even written a book, which I've read about their culture, which is really horrible, but great work, really nice. And, my question is, what do we do from here, right? I mean, how can we change these models? I mean, it's such a hopeless picture that you're presenting, which is very realistic as well. So that's the only question I have.
What I tell these people when they invite me for a workshop is get rid of this curve. This is the most toxic thing that has ever been introduced into companies, because you can take 20 Nobel laureates and put them on this curve and there will be one or two losers. And then you take the other 18 and do the same exercise 1 year later and you again have two losers. This is creating so much suffering and so much aggression that they should not engage in creating a zero-sum competition, zero-sum meritocracy. And your Uber example is important because you find this especially in this so-called new economy, when they all think they have to disrupt and smash everything and break all rules and rules don't count for them. And it's all about becoming not just the market leader, it's about crashing the competition. There can only be one Uber, one Netflix, one Facebook. So you have to kill and destroy and burn down all the competition. And that is driving these things in a way.
So is it not logical then, there's a question by Gregory, which I think he put in a direct message to me rather than to everyone, basically saying, isn't the core of the problem then competition itself?
I guess at the core of the problem is that we teach only competition since decades, and we consider this the default of human nature. And now we see all these books coming out that make the opposite claim, that the default is actually collaboration. And imagine business schools where the focus of teaching would be on collaboration. We would see very different companies, I guess.
Okay. Mariana?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Guido. So I just want to say that from the work we've done in a team of scholars on whistleblowing, in some of the organizations indeed that you mentioned, Fargo Wells, Wachovia previously, I mean, the way whistleblowers are treated is just a very good indicator of the things you describe. Having said that, I again would like to say, absolutely, I just read recently in the Financial Times quite a critical review of Welch's achievements, and that's coming from the Financial Times. That kind of says something, I suppose, right? But it is just this how the entire business model, because at the end of the day, it's not the lack of collaboration, it's just the profit maximization. Kill the competition whichever way you can, lionize these narratives to business students, and so on and so forth. Praise this as a CEO of the 20th century, this man, you know, that's all actually serving a very tangible and you know, objective that has to be really openly articulated. Is the business model is just totally flawed, and with due respect, but I don't think that collaboration can kill it. It's like when we say political CSR can kill, can amend the flawed model. You know, I don't really think so. It can kill that flawed model if it's applied properly, maybe. Sorry, thank you.
No, I agree. It's a system and systematic problem. And one of the key drivers is also that we just have the wrong role models. I mean, Jack Welch becomes manager of the century. We celebrate Elon Musk, we celebrate the Amazon guy, we celebrate all these psychopaths who have created cultures as the ones that are described. And that cannot be the case. We cannot take them as our role models and give them to our students in business case studies about that's the way to go forward. We need different role models.
Okay, thank you. Ismail, please. And
yeah, thanks a lot, Guido. I have two quick questions. The first one really, it's about zero-sum meritocracy as a precondition or a condition of possibility for violence. I think this is very convincing. I'm wondering whether there isn't perhaps a third mechanism which could get in nicely with the two you have identified. Because basically you say, well, there is the idea of meritocracy, so giving more to the winner than to the loser. And there is the idea of using this ghost curve, which means that by construction, there will be winners and losers. But there are also various ways of organizing a competition. So for example, when you play poker with friends, you can decide, is it going to be winner takes all? And is it going to be loser loses all? Which seems to be the specific type of competition that is most conducive to violence. Or could we imagine systems of solidarity which would not impede competition? So it's not about saying, now we're not comparing the performances of people, but it is about saying, well, even if you've done 140% of what the other person has done, you're not going to be paid 140%. You're not going to eat their bread because you've been working more. So I was wondering whether perhaps there is a third mechanism, which I would call perhaps winner takes all or loser loses all, which could perhaps add to your analysis of that toxic mix of competition and meritocracy.
Thanks, Ismail. That's what I would call zero-sum meritocracy, the winner takes it all cultures. So this is not so much about separating people into top and low performers. It's about this fear of humiliation, of losing my job, of all horrible things that happen to me if I'm in the loser group. That is the problem. And this exposure of people who are losers, as it happened at Wells Fargo and France Telecom, where you put lists on the wall with the number one salesperson in the last one, and everyone makes fun of them. So this is what drives this aggression, I guess.
Okay, we need to move on. Thank you very much, Guido, again. We are now moving to Professor Ella Yousfi from Paris-Dauphine University. And yeah, look forward to your talk, Ella. Over to you. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm very happy to participate to this panel with all these brilliant colleagues. I must start by saying that one of the most important feature of the organized violence of the neoliberal order is the dominance of English. So I wish I could speak in French or Arabic, but I'm going to try to make myself understood in English. So I will focus in my talk on my experience as a researcher who have worked in different Arab contexts characterized by an institutional and organized violence rooted in a persistent colonial order. I will start by a brief sketch of how the rhetoric of modernity associated with the colonial order shapes the ongoing organized violence in the Arab region. Then I will share with you some thoughts on how ethnography could help us theorize and problematize experiences of violence and resistance in sites like Tunisia or Lebanon. As you know, in the Arab region, modernity took different forms. The colonial enterprise with its natural resources and human resources extraction, the economic development rhetoric, and finally the defense of good governance and democratic transition right after the Arab revolutions. Modernity is the cement of colonial order and organized violence in the Arab region. The Arab revolutions of 2011 have revealed the enabling factors of organized violence, namely the encounter between neoliberal logics, colonial order, and authoritarian and clientelist networks of power, a hallmark of all post-colonial states in the region. As an answer to the Arab revolutions, the only path offered by international institutions is the twinning of democracy promotion with neoliberal economic dictates. Although this is not a new recipe, it echoes the rhetoric adopted by George Bush in his speech of the 11th September 2002, legitimizing the war in Iraq. He said, "We seek peace exactly where repression, resentment, and poverty are replaced by the hope for democracy, free market, and free trade." Such rhetoric is essentially aimed at exploiting the apparent support for democracy to further economic liberalization, such as austerity measures imposed by the IMF, World Bank, or negotiation to extend the European free trade policy with Arab countries. This does not, of course, exclude the West's continuous support for authoritarian regimes, particularly in Egypt, or the bombing of different populations, Palestinian, Syrian, Libyan, and all the region. The hegemonic liberal narrative of the transition to democracy in Tunisia meant in a concrete terms establishing a multi-party system, passing laws, reforming institutions, and holding elections. The purpose was to bring about good governance through best practices and by reforming institutions to make them compatible with the neoliberal order. This liberal framing of politics that was advanced by the political elite and backrolled by international donors domesticated the revolution by reducing it to procedural democracy. Under this liberal framing, political and civil rights took precedence over wealth, economic, and social demands of the revolution, mainly wealth redistribution and economic equality. On another note, the human rights paradigm used in this region and that conditioned the financial aid of international donors in the region overemphasize individual suffering over redistributive collective justice, leaving little space for revolutionary movements to adapt and rework themselves. Social movements on the ground everywhere in the Arab region, however, contested this understanding of democracy and the framing of human rights as liberal and individualist. They rather call for the fall of the regime, meaning an equitable distribution of wealth and resources and national sovereignty. This long introduction is important to show that organized violence in the Arab region is neither a force of destruction nor a thing that one could encounter during his or her fieldwork, but rather a living condition. Arab researchers do not encounter violence in the field. They live under colonial violence, economic, political, and symbolic violence, all forms of violence. The question then is how ethnography can capture the experience of living in violence. To what extent ethnography in a violent context could lead to a specific understanding of suffering and a distant form of knowledge production. For example, during my ethnographic work, on the role of the trade union UGTT in the Tunisian revolutionary process, I caught myself repeatedly singing a very popular Egyptian song that went something like this: crowded, oh world, you are so crowded, crowded, and I lost my loved ones, crowded, and there is no more mercy. It tells a lot about my emotional experience at that time. This experience helped me to understand the role of emotions in knowledge production. For instance, the fear of an uncertain future was felt in different narratives. This emotion enabled me to build bridges between different temporalities of experiences of violence: the present moment and the violence of the counter-revolution, memories of past violence related to the dictatorship, and shared fears about the future. The experience of a dictatorship and the revolution is cumulative. It leaves its imprints and marks on the bodies and souls of its subjects. This experience is also intergenerational. The trauma is not only carried for oneself, but for former generations, while conditioning the expectations of future generations regarding what a legitimate and acceptable political regime should be. In Lebanon, for example, I was impressed by the capacity of Lebanese to distinguish between the sound of fireworks and gunshots or a life-threatening Israeli bomb. Living in violence requires a great ability of reading the level of danger and terror in the everyday and identifying the borders between safe places and dangerous ones. How to resist to the organized violence? My interlocutors showed me that the resistance is the art of tunneling between different material and symbolic checkpoints. This point was raised by also Samer. This is central to the survival of subjugated, dominated groups. From a political perspective, resistance strategies in violent context helped me to better understand the complex relationships that links the border, and the issue of border is very important when we talk about dominated and subjugated and subaltern groups. The border, as experienced in my research practice, is neither a line of separation nor one of contact. It's a constituent genetic of the oppressed and mutilated bodies and souls and minds. The subject of knowledge production in violent context is therefore not a subject of the beyond, a subject of the outside. It's a subject that lays within the border. The border as a structural impediment reveals that the challenge is not to deconstruct the lines of separation, but rather to tackle the question, certainly riskier for the dominant power, of how to build border guards, enabling individuals, groups, and people who were long and methodically oppressed and exploited to recover both their dignity and sovereignty. These borders, set up by organized violence that took different forms: bombs, police repression, visa, refugees camps, discrimination in the workplace, remind us that there is no dignity without power, and calls for replacing the ethics of recognition underlying the concepts of humanism, the ambivalent concept of humanism and inclusion or multiculturalism associated with the managerial jargon, rooted in European moral philosophy, of which Hegel was the most emblematic figure, with a theory of dignity in the Fanonian, Frantz Fanon tradition, capable of putting back at the heart of the debate the material living conditions of subaltern individuals, forms of life-death, and the history of political, artistic, and intellectual revolts led by Blacks, Arabs, refugees, immigrants, women, and oppressed groups to impose their denied humanity, that we may decipher the ongoing liberation process. In conclusion, and in contrast with the ideal of emancipation rooted in the Modernity project that focus on freeing individuals from the pressure of the group, the resistance to organized colonial violence that I witnessed in different Arab countries does not seek emancipation. There is no word to translate the word emancipation. They would talk about tahrir, and tahrir means liberation. So the word liberation is a way to acquire freedoms, freedom from colonial order, but also freedom from various kinds of exploitations. These freedoms are the rights of every human being, which is not the framework of the imperial world in which we live. I will leave it there because I think this is 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hella, and totally appreciate the fact that we're all speaking English, which is another form of violence that has occurred in history. So thank you very much. Any comments, questions, and feedback again, please? Mariana, go.
Sorry, it's also interesting, so I don't want to comment. I just want to applaud Hella as a non-English speaker who speaks 4 other languages, nevertheless, quite fluently. There you are, a work in progress, always trying to adjust, right? But not just that, congratulate you for the border concept and everything. I really appreciate that. But can I, Stefan, take 30 seconds to just say that Mar Peretz from M. Lyon, Yulia Shimko from Odense, and Ghazi Islam from Grenoble, and myself will be having call for papers in ethics, business ethics quarterly on politics of life and death. I'll put that on a chat if people want. A submission date is in May 2023. So if people are interested, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, if you could put that in the chat, that would be great. Thank you, Mariana. Okay, any other comments, feedback, please? As Bobby just helpfully pointed out in a direct message to me, I've completely misplanned this and invited far too many speakers, and it's all terrible that we are beyond time, and it's all my fault. Yes, it is. You're absolutely right. But the idea was really to assemble a disparate group, a fuzzy group of scholars talking about violence in many different ways, and so that was the original idea. And I'm very grateful that we've heard so many disparate, very different perspectives from different parts of the world. Sama, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to. Well, first of all, thanks for a fantastic talk, and I was going to ask Hella if she would just expand a bit deeper, kind of, Mariana had mentioned it, but the concept of borders, and it's one of the things that I've also struggled to how we think about, theorize, how we empirically think about it in our work, and you've thought about it much more than I and many. I wonder if you might just elaborate a bit more about how you think about the conceptual, but also empirically how we might think in and around borders.
Samir, you are asking me a very difficult question. Actually, I have written a paper on this question of border, linked to the discussion around border thinking as formulated by the decolonial Latin American tradition. And what I brought as a concept is the concept of fahlawa. Fahlawa, it's the name, it's the art of tunneling between different checkpoints, and it's an Egyptian word used by Arabs to resist the Iranian rule at that times. And the difference between fahlawa and border thinking is that the borders in our context, an Arab context, is a matter of survival. I mean, you are more familiar than me with the borders in Palestine. I mean, if you have a pregnant woman and she needs to go to hospital, she can span 4 hours. So this idea of fahlawa is linked more to the story of survival, to violence, rather than this idea of dialogue when it comes to the broader thinking tradition. So I can send you the article if you are interested. The idea of border is very also present in Tunisia and in countries living under dictatorship, because there is a border between the opponents, political opponents, and the pro-regime, and you can situate places where you can speak freely, and places where you feel in prison. So yeah, I don't want to take much time, but we can follow on this conversation later on. So, but basically, the idea of border, the way I am tackling it in my work, is quite different from the border thinking tradition as it was theorized in the decolonial Latin American tradition.
Thank you, Ella. Okay, so we have one last speaker. I realized we're out of time. Again, my misplanning, really, my fault. But if you are able to stay, then that would be great. If not, the recording will be available. I'll send it around, you know, to the people who registered this event, so you can catch up on it later. But if you're able to stay, please listen to my colleague Stefano Pascucci. And I guess that was one of the other starting points for this event, really, because Stefan and I published a paper in the Academy of Management Perspectives about 2 years ago, something like that, Stefano, on this very topic, providing our own sort of insights into how we can think about organized violence, but coming from Naples and the Naples region himself, I guess, you know, Stefano's got his own take on organized violence. So over to you. Stefano is professor in circular economy at the University of Exeter and my colleague here in Cornwall. So over to you, Stefano.
Thanks very much, Steffen, and thank you all. There's been really an impressive learning journey. I've been thinking, you know, I'm the last speaker, and I was really trying hard to find perhaps a way of ending this with perhaps a bit more positive notes, if you like, or a lively narrative, but I'm sorry, I can't. So let me bring you to Naples. And I needed a presentation because I'm quite an empiricist, and I need boundary objects to speak in a way. So I need comfort and safe space of a PowerPoint. So let me bring you to farming in Naples. That's the place I come from. And to introduce the topic, and if you think about food, farming, Naples, south of Italy, you start romanticized, you think about pizza, you think about pasta, you think about the food paradise. But actually what I experienced is quite the opposite. And this research will tell you that this is hell, actually, much more close to hell than paradise. Let me give you a few figures so we understand each other and where I come from. At the age of 5, I've been sexually assaulted 3 times, as far as I can remember. At the age of 13, I've been robbed, I don't know how many times, probably at least 15 times. Bullying was the everyday practice around me. At the age of 23, while writing my master's dissertation, my student flat was occupied by a mafia guy who was hiding from police. I've witnessed 3 people murdered in the street just behind the student flat, and so on and so forth. So those are the figures of my life in Naples. And it tells you that you don't have to have brown skin, you don't have to be necessarily colonized or recognized as a minority, and you don't have to be necessarily exploited into a class position. And I know some of you are now becoming a bit bothered of what I'm saying, to experience organized violence. The beauty of Naples, it exposed you to organized violence in a quite peculiar way, and I would like to perhaps discuss this with you. So what has happened recently has been this idea of looking at a phenomenon that has been called the land of fires, from the Italian terra dei fuochi. This is a way that has been manifested, a phenomenon that has been quite well narrated in various publications and coverage, and narrates the doing of the mafia. And you know, we have this representation of mafia as a hierarchical and you know, again romanticized organization. You know, this is the Godfather representation of mafia. Of course, mafia is also something else, and it is about manipulating markets. It is about using resources and people, and so on and so forth. So what is the land of fires, and why is this relevant, and why it matters for what we are doing today? So this is a geography of extreme precarity that has been unfolding for almost 4 decades, and perhaps is one of the hidden, if you like, face of capitalism, perhaps. So it is about waste and waste management, and how the state, the mafia, and people living in that area have been dealing with this, particularly farmers, because waste needs to go somewhere. It's a physical something, it's an object, and carries with it a number of issues. So for decades, an alliance between some sort of mafia-like organizations, as well as a more recognized, legalized organizations, we can call them corporates or businesses, and perhaps parts of what we call the state have been kind of operating in this space. Now, why this relevant, and again, why we call it land of fires, and why land of fires? It's more than just a phenomenon, in my view. It tells you something about what I would call socio-ecological displacement. So by the way, the definition of land of fires is because the local population, bothered perhaps by these rubbish left intentionally or unintentionally everywhere, in the street, in the farm fields, and so on, started to burn it. And this became quite quickly a very profitable practice by mafia people. So they started burning because it was a way of eliminating waste, and that's why it describes this dispersed, diffused burning and illegal waste dumping. So that's the geography I'm describing. This has been featured in different books and movies, and it's quite specific geography. You see in the northwest province of Naples. That's indeed the south of Italy. This has triggered, of course, protest. This hasn't gone unnoticed, and has created a social movement or a platform of social movement of grassroots organizations fighting, protesting for what we would call environmental justice. The part of the land of fires that interested me at this stage, and some colleagues recently have been working with Elise Lopedes, who is in this room with us, virtual room, has been this particular engagement of waste management and illegal landfill management with farming. So on top of the burning and illegal dumping, that's how the crisis, this accumulation of waste in this area has manifested. So those are piles of waste bulks that you see forms nice architectures, and the state has confiscated farmland for farmers in that province, basically without consultation, and goes without saying, without any transparent mechanism. And you see, this is the progressive, this is the urban fringe and how waste occupies farmland. Now, what's going on here, and I'm going quickly because I know I've got only a couple of minutes now, is the situation of Giovanni. And Giovanni could be me, actually, or could be anyone farming in that area. So he's a guy who inherited the farm from his father. He's farming since ever. And one digging a groove in his fields, he discovered that he had been filled with waste of all sorts, really, turning his farm into an illegal dump. Now, what interested me, and Giovanni is a fictional name, but this is coming from the quotes of our fieldwork, Giovanni didn't call the police, and nor went and discussed that with his neighbor, didn't call the local newspaper, didn't send a complaint note to his representatives at the regional national parliament. He basically did not protest, he would say. He didn't oppose to them. And then the question would be why? And my answer, tentatively, is that Giovanni is a displaced person. He's still living in his farm, he's still living in his house, if you like, but is experiencing a socio-ecological displacement that is at the same time physical and symbolic. Because displacement is indeed something that has got a temporal dimension and a relational dimension, we know that very well, but has something to do with the condition you live in, of course. And recent literature has started to connect the idea of displacement, if you like, the opposite of placemaking, with conditions of extreme precarity, and also the absence of relations of recognition. So basically, he, in my view, and many like him, are displaced because they lack any relations of recognition. They are unseen, unheard. They have no voice. There is absence of mattering in their life. So, well, I can jump ahead. So you say, so what? I think this is particularly interesting and deals perhaps with the way we are theorizing the Anthropocene. I think waste is a manifestation of the Anthropocene. I mentioned capitalism or neoliberal relations. I think it tells us about some sort of fundamental structural socio-ecological condition of humanity. So I would challenge Bobby saying, it's not just about necro-capitalism. I think it's about necro-humanism in a way, or post-humanism to a certain extent. So what we're trying to do is to problematize this idea of creating or making place and filling this place. And I think this connects to the topic of today, because perhaps when we look at the obvious, when we look at those categories, being brown or white, being indigenous or not, these categories may help us easily, if you like, painfully, but perhaps a bit more easily, to recognize who are the displaced, who are the oppressed, who are the exploited. But what if you are trying to theorize my condition? What am I? Because I'm a white male person, apparently, right? I don't belong to an indigenous culture to a certain extent, and so on and so forth. So why do I feel as displaced as Giovanni? So those are the obvious displaced. But perhaps in the modern societies, we do have hidden, unnoticed, displaced subjects or groups. And I'm mentioning here just a few through snapshot figures. Discuss, that's about me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, very insightful. And yes.
Stop sharing now.
Quite a few links to other presentations. I feel very heartened by the fact that we still have 30 people in the room, although we are, almost half an hour late. So it goes to show that people would like to stay and make time for this. So thank you very much for that. So any comments, questions, feedback to Stefano, please?
I told you I couldn't help with a bit more lively note. We live troubled times, and we carried this with us.
Jana is as lively as ever. You said you're not feeling well, but you seem to be doing all right.
So interesting. So I just want to thank Stefano and thank everyone and say goodbye at this point, because I really have to check out. But this was phenomenal, especially when you look at different notions of displacement. And so, of course, there are obviously displaced people, and we shouldn't undermine that and shouldn't draw easy comparisons. But, you know, as Kristeva would have said, we are, you know, eternally displaced because we are strangers to our own psyche and how that psyche is manifested itself in the social. Sorry, my little addition. But thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Stefan, for organizing. And thanks to everyone. Yeah, and please do consider the call for papers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining, Jana. Thank you. I mean, it's maybe maybe it can be turned into a question. So displacement is that aren't we all? I guess that's what Jana is asking. Aren't we all displaced in a variety of different ways? Or
that is such a privileged, arrogant view to take. That comparing my displacement in London to somebody whose home livelihood has been destroyed, that is a classic Eurocentric view to take.
Pardon, Bobby, I didn't hear the final thing. Sorry, could you repeat?
It's a classic modern thing to say.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's very much modern, and it completely dehistoricizes, you know, of the notion of displacement. You know, it suddenly levels the playing field. It's no question of understanding the nuances of different kinds of power that lead to it, right? There's no understanding of how gender works, or race works, or class works, or religion works. So it's just, you know, well, we're all displaced. It's your classic postmodern trope.
This is not what I said, Bobby, I guess, right?
No, I was commenting on the thing about we're all displaced at different levels, and I'm saying we have to be very careful. It's like about violence. It's about, you know, colonialism. We're all colonized with a small c. Of course we are, but that doesn't negate the very different and specific legacies which are currently playing out materially even today, 200 years after colonialism, whatever, 100 years after colonialism had directly ended, is still being played out. So there's this deflection from the material realities of different kinds of displacement is a problem, because again, we're completely enraptured with epistemologies and not understanding the different ontologies of whether it's displacement, violence, refugees, sustainability, all of that.
So here, then Richard, please.
Well, thank you very much, Stefano. As fellow Italian, I am extremely touched by your presentation, and it's absolutely right. We forget about these realities that we live through. So question is, how can we make sure we don't forget, in your opinion?
I mean, possibly the reason why I expose myself, because I wanted to be clear also why I'm doing the research I'm doing, also responding to a call that some of the colleagues in this room have really recently asked, you know, like coming out, being explicitly engaged. So I suppose where I'm humbly trying to figure my way out in this world is basically, you know, what I said. It's like I don't find myself immediately positioned in the obvious categories that would create an engagement for me or an identity as a scholar to deal with, for example, organized violence. But organized violence is really part of my identity, and that's where I found a conversation very problematic, because I on one hand I want to be inclusive, and I feel it. So I want to have a conversation with Bobby but I don't have these categories necessarily as obvious for my own reality. That's what I'm trying to say. And also, you see immediately, you run the risk of the trivialization of others' conditions, because you start saying, yeah, we are all displaced, even the white male professor is displaced, and so, displacement is not important, kind of thing. I don't want to create that conversation. It's not my intention. But where should I position this form of displacement that I do feel? How do I study it or interrogate it? And that was my kind of entry point in this. What we're
I think there was a wonderful quote by, what's that? Rigberto Menchu, who the indigenous activist, and who was, when she became kind of world famous in the West, who recognized her, she was saying, if you are here to help me, I don't want you. If your struggle is tied up with mine, then yes, please take my hand. And a similar thing happened when during the time of independence, when Mahatma Gandhi visited the mills of Manchester in his boycott the textiles from England because they had destroyed the Indian industry. They actually sent him to Manchester thinking that the workers were going to be extremely aggressive against him because they were taking their livelihoods away. And strangely enough, the mill workers in Manchester embraced Gandhi by saying, you understand our struggle here, not our mill bosses. Yes, we understand, why do you want to? So they actually understood the connections much better than the mill owners. And at that point of time, the rulers of England. So that's the connection Stefano was trying to make. That of course there are connections, but there are also very deeply different histories. And that connection between a mill worker in Lancaster and the Indian freedom fighter, a very elite, Indian freedom fighter. He was certainly not a working class person, completely elite, upper caste, highly educated, right? And look at those connections from somebody in Manchester or Lancaster fighting the same fight in a way. And I suppose those are the conversations I think we should be trying to explore.
We've got two more hands up. Richard, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Stefano, for your courage in talking about your experience of violence. I wish I had your courage. Two things that occur to me. I mean, it's more about the session as a whole, because there are two topics which I'm surprised have not come up. One is slavery, which is far older than capitalism, and yet underpins capitalism to a great extent, and it's, I think slavery possibly is one of the sources of our displacement from ourselves, which some philosophers might argue. The other thing that hasn't been talked about is non-violence, and there is a huge, wonderful history of studies of non-violence. I mean, Bobby, you've mentioned Gandhi, of course, but Judith Butler has a really interesting recent book on non-violence. Those are the two things I wanted to say.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I've been, again, humbly engaging with Judith's work. In fact, the lack of relation of recognitions comes from her work, among many other concepts. But I found it quite relevant for what I'm trying to do, we are trying to do. And it has something to do with placemaking or unmaking. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Guido had his virtual or actual physical hand up there. Go.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. And thanks, Stefano, for the presentation. Super interesting. And you know that I worked on the same phenomenon. And I wanted to add a point to what you said. The question of why these farmers do not protest. In the very moment where they would protest, they would contribute to their own displacement because they would make their land useless. they would tell everyone my land is toxic, so no one can buy my fruits and vegetables anymore. So they would, what you call this displacement, they would reinforce that effect on themselves, because there were protests. And what happened after the protests was that the market for fruits and vegetables from that region collapsed. So those who were courageous to speak up were punished by losing even their land, their work and everything. So I guess this is an important element of the story that you might want to include.
Thanks, Guido. Yes, that's an aspect we are also considering. Thank you. Perhaps good for an offline follow-up, well, online.
And this, by the way, and the stigma attached to that, right? Just to say, with displacement comes stigma, with violence comes stigma, with marginalization comes stigma. And that's why, you know, we find it so difficult to speak about. So thank you so much, everyone, for this incredible session. Thank you for organizing, Steffen.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I mean, needless to say that there's no synthesis of the concept and experience of violence intended with this session. You know, the idea was really to sort of give voice to many different kind of experiences and conceptualizations, and there's so many intersectional things going on here. Very difficult to kind of say, you know, this is that and that's something else. You know, there's so many interconnections, which I think has become clear in this session. So, you know, we've heard, obviously, you know, the starting point was the Ukraine war, but, you know, we've heard about colonialism quite a lot. We heard about, you know, experiences of violence in big corporations, marginalizations of Black people. We've heard about ontological struggles between modernity and the pluriverse. We've heard lots of different things. So it's you know, I think it's a rich research field, but of course, as we've clearly heard, that this is closer to ourselves and our bodies than you know we would like to think sometimes. So thank you all for staying so long. We're running quite a lot over the allocated time, but I you know, really enjoyed hearing all these experiences. Thank you for your time and for your courage to come and speak about these sometimes very uncomfortable truths. And let me close by saying and giving everyone you know, courage to carry on this work, because yeah, this kind of, you know, truth telling to the authorities, which is, you know, really important, particularly in these troubled times. So thank you all, and as I said, the recording will be available, and thanks for joining, and we shall leave it there for now, and see you in another space another time. Okay,
thanks to everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.